Hey there, everybody. I'm Claire Tansey. I'm a cookbook author and a cooking teacher, and I am excited today. I'm going to show you how to make a delicious dish from my new book, Dinner Uncomplicated. And this is a vegan ragu, which kind of mimics a bolognese sauce, but it is made with mushrooms and lentils. So let's get started. To make this ragu, you will need some white mushrooms. This is a can of lentils. I've got some tomato paste, a can of whole tomatoes. These are dried porcini mushrooms, more on those in a moment. I've got some white wine, rosemary, onion, garlic, and celery, and just one nice big pot. So that is what it takes to make this, and let's get started on actually making it. So to start this recipe, I am actually going to soak these dried mushrooms. Now, dried porcini mushrooms are wonderful little flavor bombs. They are intensely delicious, but they're dry. So it's like a piece of wood. So what you have to do is actually sort of rehydrate them before putting them in any recipe. So I'm just going to cover this with some boiling water, about a cup of boiling water. Right over top of these little mushrooms. And then they'll just soak under there for about 10 minutes. And what will happen is they'll become nice and soft. It's a very aromatic, very fragrant kind of a smell, very intense and rich flavor. And so the smell is also quite intense and rich. So I'm just going to set those aside while I get started on the chopping for this recipe. So of course it starts with an onion, like all good things. All good recipes start with an onion. And I am going to mince up this little onion. I'm also going to open my recipe book so I can keep track. There it is, a beautiful mushroom and lentil ragu. And I like to serve this over polenta or pasta, just like I would a kind of a more traditional meat bolognese sauce. Okay, so one onion here, and this is just a regular old-fashioned yellow Canadian onion. Fantastic product. I use them all year round. And in order to get this onion kind of finely chopped or almost minced, my best way to do it is to take off the top and bottom of the onion. I like to think of it like a globe. That's the Arctic and the Antarctic. And then I go straight down the international date line, and I've got 2 halves of an onion. So now I can easily peel off that little bit of skin, and this guy too. Sometimes some onions give up their peel a little more willingly than others. Get rid of that. And then I'm going to finely chop this. So in order to finely chop it, this is great. I've got it's nice and secure. It's not going to go anywhere. So I'm actually going to make one horizontal cut here. So that's just right down almost to the back, but not quite. And then a couple of vertical cuts this way. And then I'll just chop through the onion to get little tiny cubes. Once I get down to the end, cut that in half and then run that through. Just before I do the other half of the onion, I'll turn on my pan. For this sauce, I'm using a nice wide frying pan. It's deep and wide. And that's important because I want a lot of the liquid, the kind of water in all the different ingredients in this dish to evaporate and to concentrate. So it's important that it's a nice wide pan. Now this is non-stick. It wouldn't have to be non-stick. I'm going to put some oil in here anyways, but it's good to get it hot, get it good and roasty toasty hot before I put the oil in. So while I cut the second half of the onion, I can just get that pan heating up. I always say when you're chopping anything, slow and right is better than fast and wrong. Although I have chopped possibly 1 trillion, give or take a billion onions in my life, don't feel you need to go as fast as I do. Okay, so a couple tablespoons full of canola oil go into the pan. Now the pan is getting quite nice and warm. I love canola oil, great neutral flavor, obviously a beautiful Canadian product, really affordable, really accessible. So a nice little lump of canola oil in there, and then I'll add the onions. The heat here is on over medium-low. I kind of want the onions to cook quite slowly, almost like to sweat. So sweating is sort of a slow cooking. Sweating is a slow cooking of onions and celery in particular, sometimes carrots as well, that gets them really tender without getting them too brown. Okay, so I'm going to add some celery here as well, and I've got 3 stalks of celery. I'll just trim off the kind of dried out bits at the top and bottom. Those are great for the stock pot if you got a stock pot on the go. If not to worry, they can also go in the compost. I want these celery pieces to be finely chopped, and the way I do that is actually going to cut each one into kind of long sticks. So this one stalk of celery, just being careful with the tip of my knife to keep that nice and even. So I've got those 3 pieces there, and I'll do the same for the other 2 stalks of celery here. Another great winter vegetable. Celery is sort of with us year-round, and I feel like it's really misunderstood. People think it's only good for the beginning of a sauce, but I absolutely love celery. I love the flavor. For this recipe, I want it to be, as I said, finely chopped, so nice and small. So I'm just lined up all those sticks of celery, and I'm gonna run my knife through them, being careful, of course, not to get any of my fingertips in there. There we go. And that can go into the pan with the onions. It's great that the heat is on just over medium-low here, because that means that the onions are cooking nice and slow, nice and gentle, not too fast. And I have time to get my celery chopped and added to the pan at the same time. There, that's the other half of the celery. Now, I mentioned that I am sweating these vegetables. That is a cooking term that really just means I'm cooking them, as I said earlier, a little bit slowly to make sure that they get tender without getting too brown. But the key ingredient whenever you're sweating vegetables is salt. You've got to have some salt in there. Think of it, sweat is salty. If you ever have to taste your own sweat, it is salty. So you've always got to get some salt in there. And that's going to help to break down the cellular structure of the onions and the celery and get them to soften up really nicely, which is really, really important to this sauce. We don't want crunchy vegetables in there. We want this to be really lovely and unctuous and kind of soft and yummy. So into here, I'm actually going to add a full teaspoon of salt. This is why I have a 1/4 teaspoon measure, I cannot say. But it does take quite a lot of salt. So this is one of the only items that we're putting in this entire recipe that is salt, and it is in fact salt. So we're not adding a lot of other ingredients that have any salt in them, so it's important to get a lot of seasoning in at this stage. So what's happening here now is the onions and celery are just here in the pan, starting to smell good. I'm gonna put them into a nice even layer. Again, the heat is just on medium-low here, and I'm gonna let this cook for about 10 minutes. That is sort of a nice slow pace to get lovely, tender, translucent vegetables. Not to worry, there's lots to do in the meantime. Just wanna have a quick check-in on the dried mushrooms. Take a look. So it's still quite warm. They're nice and soft now. They'll pull apart really easily, and eventually I'm gonna just fish those out, save that liquid. That is like also very, very savory and delicious, but I'll be fishing those out and adding them to the rest of the mix in a little while. In the meantime though, I gotta get some mushrooms going on in here, and I have got a pound, 500 grams of plain old-fashioned regular white mushrooms, and instead of chopping them, I actually grate them for this. So I get out my box grater, this old friend, and simple as that, simple as grating cheese, I am just going to run the mushrooms through the grater so they get into teeny tiny little bits. You could also pulse your mushrooms in a food processor if you felt like it, if yours was close to hand. My food processor is in the cupboard. you know, it's a bit of a pain to get it out of the cupboard and get it all set up. So I don't mind just running the mushrooms through the grater. It's also really easy, barely takes any effort at all. I grate the mushrooms because mushrooms are mostly water. And what I want from them what they're going to contribute to this ragu is flavor. And I need to get rid of as much of their moisture as possible. They're also adding a ton of bulk to this sauce. And, but again, I don't want it to be like a thin, watery, insipid tasting sauce. So the quickest way for me to get moisture out of these mushrooms when I cook them is to have them in tiny little pieces so that as much moisture can escape them as possible once they're in the pan. And the simplest way to do that is to grate them. So like I said, if you feel like grabbing the food processor and just giving them a quick blitz, that's also terrific. Every now and then you can feel free to give your celery and onions a little stir. They're looking great, not even golden a little bit. They're just starting to get nice and soft, smelling really great. If they were getting golden at this stage, it would make sense to lower the heat because it hasn't been that long. Again, I just want them to get really, really tender before they get golden at all. And meanwhile, I'm still grating mushrooms. I developed this recipe for Dinner Uncomplicated because I'd had so many requests from people on my first book tour and from my students for vegetarian and specifically vegan recipes for main courses that they could feel comfortable serving even to people who love meat. And the great news is that's me too. I love meat, but I also really like to keep my diet really diverse. So I eat a lot of plant forward or plant-based stuff. And so it was a nice, fun challenge for me to try to replicate Italian bolognese sauce, which there's a recipe for in the book as well, which uses pork and beef and milk and Parmesan, to kind of try to replicate that, but without any of the animal products. And I didn't want to go to any weird extremes. You know, I never like to use ingredients that are hard to find or that are really expensive. So I was really just trying to use ordinary ingredients that I could find at my local grocery store. And even the porcini mushrooms, you can find them in many, many grocery stores. They are really common. If you can't find them in your regular grocery store, you can certainly find them at any Italian store. But they're actually quite easy to find in general. And the porcini mushrooms do so much work in this recipe. They bring the intensity of flavor that we need. So whenever you're doing a vegan recipe, you really need to be using ingredients that have a ton of intense flavor. Because when we think about non-vegan ingredients like Parmesan or like cheese, other types of cheese, or even browned meats, those are ingredients that often bring a lot of the flavor to our recipes. So when you're doing vegan recipes, you got to kind of amp up the flavor in other ways. So on top of the porcini mushrooms, I'm also going to add fresh rosemary, which brings a lot of flavor. It's actually a secret ingredient of a lot of recipe developers is fresh rosemary. I'm also going to use tomato paste, plus some white wine and a lot of garlic. Okay, my mushrooms are almost grated. A little bit meditative here. And the onions and celery are still looking very nice. I hesitate to say they're looking great because I'm looking at a grater. Hey, come for the food, stay for the jokes. All right, look at this pile of mushrooms I got here. Thank you, grater. That was terrific. Take a quick look at the onion and celery mixture here now. So those vegetables are starting to look great, starting to get a little bit translucent, not completely there yet, almost. Lovely kind of almost spicy smell of celery coming out of there. It smells absolutely terrific. In the meantime, I'm actually going to prepare the garlic. I don't want to add the mushrooms until those are fully softened. So I'm going to put transfer the mushrooms into here. And I'll just prepare my garlic, which goes in at the same time as the mushrooms. All right, so 3 cloves of garlic goes into this, and I have 3 cloves which are very different sizes. It's like I've got the daddy bear, the mama bear, and the little baby bear here. But that's good. It all amounts up to 3 garlic cloves, so I'll get the skin off of them just by giving them a nice, good, solid, firm but gentle crush. Great tip when you're peeling garlic is just to get your fingers a little bit damp. Just a little tiny bit of water on them, and then the peel doesn't stick to your fingers. This garlic is extremely fresh, and it's very juicy, so that means it's gonna stick probably no matter what I do. But I'll just get the peel off of that. And then I want this garlic to be minced, which you can do by hand with a knife, but I actually like to use my garlic press for this. It's the fastest and simplest way to get minced garlic into a dish. Yeah, this peel on this skin is on this garlic is peeled. That still will not come off. All right, good, got it. Oh, not quite. Because the mushrooms and the garlic goes in at the same time, I can just crush the garlic right into the bowl of mushrooms here. Crush that out. Use the back of a knife to scrape that off. Get rid of the remainder. Get those guys in there. Lovely, nice, strong, fresh garlic. Beautiful. And by the time I get this cleaned out and rinsed, it'll be time to add to the pan. All right, so this pan is now almost dry. There's not a ton of liquid coming out of these anymore, and there's just a little bit of golden happening here and there on some of the vegetables. This is the perfect time to add these mushrooms and this garlic. Now, as I said, this is mushrooms are mostly water, so when I add these, I'm actually going to need to turn up the heat. I'm going to turn the heat up to medium, stir this in, get that garlic in there too. And now what I'm trying to do is cook this until the mushrooms lose a lot of their moisture and get nice and tender. That's going to take about 10 minutes. It's a bit of a slow process. Another great reason why it's so helpful to use a wide pan here, because it'll really encourage this process to be a little bit faster. If the sides of this pot were too deep, it could steam a little bit, and I really want it to evaporate. And of course, the salt that is already in there, that already did that good work on the onions and the celery, is now going to also work on the mushrooms. So in the meantime, I am going to take the soaked mushrooms here out of the mushroom liquid. So you can see that the liquid itself is quite dark brown. So I'm going to get these out of here. Give them a little squeeze. Okay. Now I am going to save this liquid. It's just important to note that at the very bottom of the bowl, there'll be a little bit of sediment. There's a little bit of dirt. And so as I pour the liquid out of this bowl and into the pot in a minute, I'm going to be careful to hold back a little bit just so that sediment doesn't go into the pot. But in the meantime, I can take these, well, they're kind of funny looking slabs of mushroom. They're funny looking, but they're packed with flavor. And I am going to mince these little babies up. Now that those mushrooms are minced, I'm just going to add them to this bowl. And in this bowl, I have a can of lentils that I have drained and rinsed. Fantastic way to use lentils. That's so different from using them dried. I do use a lot of dried lentils as well, usually dried orange lentils, but I love these canned lentils, first of all, for the convenience, and also I think they just have a really fun texture. In this particular dish, lentils are doing a bunch of different things. First of all, they are adding an amazing source of protein and fiber. They're also adding a lot of bulk and heft, and they're gonna make this dish really filling, really satisfying, and really hearty. So let's check on our little pan full of mushrooms here. Lots of moisture coming out into the bottom of the pan. That's great, because as the moisture comes out of the mushrooms and it starts to evaporate, that's exactly what we want to have happen here. So just a few more ingredients are going to go into this pan once the mushrooms have really cooked and concentrated. I've got a whole can of whole tomatoes, a whole can of whole tomatoes. And I want to crush them. So the way I do that is I just sort of hold the whole tomatoes with my fingers and whoops, tip the tip the juice into a bowl like this. That's good. This one got away here. And then being careful, because sometimes there's a sharp edge on the inside of your can, I actually just use my hand to crush these tomatoes. I really prefer using whole tomatoes as opposed to already diced tomatoes. The whole ones, I don't know, they just seem to have more tomato flavor. I often find the tomatoes that come already diced in the can, nothing wrong with them, but I sometimes find they can be quite hard, like as if they're not quite ripe enough, whereas these whole tomatoes are always so sweet and delicious. I love whole tomatoes, even if I have to go to the extra effort of crushing them myself. This in itself is kind of a fun task, crushing these tomatoes. And I'm impressed with myself. I usually get tomato juice all over myself and all over the counter. Not today. And I am going to use the liquid and the tomatoes. So even though I have taken the liquid out, I'm going to add everything once these are crushed. You just can't crush the tomatoes when the can is still full of liquid because it'll overflow. All right, so these are roughly crushed now, so I'm going to add that into that bowl there. Give myself a little wash off. Another quick check on our mushroom friends here. Let's see what we got. So lots and lots of liquid coming out here. Awesome. Really, really good. At this point, I could almost turn the heat up even higher, because the mushrooms are looking quite soft. I really want to get rid of all of that moisture. And I know what you're saying, but Claire, aren't you just going to add a whole lot more moisture back in? I am, but all the moisture I'm going to add back in is flavorful moisture. So what we're getting rid of here is the flavorless water, and we are going to be replacing it with, first of all, that really intensely flavored mushroom soaking juice, the tomato juice, the liquid in there, and of course, white wine. And white wine is so important in this recipe. The alcohol will burn off, but the flavor of the wine does so much work in terms of making this ragu really feel slow cooked, delicious, and full in terms of the flavor, even though there isn't a single animal product in it. I also have a tomato paste. Another great way to add concentrated tomato flavor, and I just always use the whole can, and I'm going to add it right in to that big bowl of tomatoes. There we go. I always use the whole can because I'm so tired of trying to figure out ways to save the rest of my tomato paste, which ultimately I would just end up forgetting about. So I just use the whole can. It's delicious. Add that extra tomatoey flavor. Mushrooms still going strong here. Still losing a lot of liquid. Really, really good. This is so important. So don't rush this step because you really need this step to concentrate all of these flavors. Okay, one more ingredient I need to get ready, and that is my little bit of chopped rosemary. I have fresh rosemary here. I only need a tablespoon, which is not too many. But rosemary is quite a strong herb. It's considered a very bold, very flavorful herb, very strong in flavor. And that's what we want, right? I said that earlier, that when we're cooking vegan, when we're cooking vegan dishes, you really need to use those big flavors. So those dried mushrooms, this fresh rosemary, that extra hit of tomato paste. And that's what's going to make this dish feel really full and taste satisfying as well as being satisfying. So my rosemary here, I've got the little needles off of the stalk. I'm going to kind of line them up, almost like I did with the celery, except on a much smaller scale. Line them up in a row and then carefully run the knife through them. And then once they're chopped, I can just do another little go around here. There. Okay, now all of my ingredients are ready to go in. Just as the mushrooms are doing their last gasp, giving up that last little bit of liquid, I can do a quick tidy up. Never hurts to have a clean kitchen. Always makes the afterwards feel that much easier. All right, look at this now. We have got mostly dry pan here. Lots of steam still coming off of here, but there's not a lot of liquid in the bottom of the pan. So good timing. Now we can get everything is going to go back into here. So let's look first at this mushroom liquid. And remember, I wanted to go nice and easy so I don't get the sediment that's at the bottom of the bowl. So that goes in. You see now, you see how there's just a little bit of dirt floating around in there? We don't want that. We don't want dirt in our sauce. The tomato paste, the tomatoes, the tomato juice, and the rosemary. Welcome to the party, guys. Give these a nice little stir around here. Sometimes the tomato paste is a bit hard to break up. Gorgeous. 1 cup of white wine. Now this is a dry white wine. That is important. You do not want to be using a sweet wine here. And of course those chopped mushrooms and that can of lentils. So it is quite a melange of ingredients here, and it does look like a bit of a mess right now, but that's okay. What I'm going to do now is allow this to come up to a full simmer, a really good vigorous simmer, and I'm going to let it cook for about a half an hour. So that does probably sound like quite a long time to cook, but you can see how much liquid there is in here. And once again, I need to concentrate this as much as possible. I want intense flavors with this. So that is the secret. You just want to get this going, get the heat nice and high, and then let that simmer for 30 minutes. All right, while that comes up to a simmer, I'm going to tidy up a bit and I'll come back and check on it as soon as it's coming up to a simmer. This is just starting to come up to a simmer. Just take a couple of minutes. You can see now it is bubbling quite nicely there and there. And I'll just keep the heat moderate so that it continues to cook at a nice, kind of a rapid simmer here. And I'll stir it often enough, but I'll probably just putter around the kitchen and maybe empty the dishwasher, or like tidy up a little bit, or maybe make a salad, or maybe I'll make some toasted breadcrumbs to put on top. But I'm going to let this cook now for about 30 minutes at a nice good simmer. All right, well, this beautiful thing has been simmering for about 30 minutes. The house smells amazing. It's looking really rich, nice and concentrated. Don't take my word for it. Look at that. Looks like a gorgeous, rich, lovely, thick sauce. So the final thing I like to do here is actually I'm going to just turn the heat off, and I'm going to give this just a gentle little puree, just about half of it. And you can either puree it with an immersion blender or with your potato masher. I like to just puree about half of it so that it still has some nice chunkiness, but that it sort of gives a bit more of a sauciness to the whole dish. So I'm just going to do this real carefully, really carefully. And just here and there. Because all those vegetables are so tender, they just puree into a lovely creaminess. Yeah, that looks pretty good. That looks pretty good. I'm not really trying to replicate bolognese. Like, I don't want this to either look or taste like meat. But that was definitely my inspiration. And so when the final product looks like this and smells like this, to me, it gives the same delicious impression of hearty comfort food that I get from a really traditional Italian bolognese that's made with milk and butter and cheese and meat. But this is completely vegan. This is a delicious sauce. It really freezes well as well. So this is actually from the Make Ahead chapter in my book. And it's a terrific sauce that you could make and freeze and then have, as a favor to your future self somewhere down the road. What I like to do with this is I'll serve this either over some nice soft creamy polenta or even just over some cooked pasta. I think that's what I'm going to do tonight. If you are fully vegan, you may want to make some optional pangritata, that is toasted breadcrumbs to go on top. If you don't mind a little Parmesan in your life, it wouldn't be wrong here. I hope you enjoy this delicious, hearty, completely vegan, 100% Canadian, and 100% times 2 delicious, easy weeknight dinner. I'm Claire Tansey. Thank you for joining me today. And remember that life is complicated and cooking doesn't have to be. So happy cooking.